You all set? Well, welcome everybody. I'm Tom Patterson. I'm one of the co-founders of Boston Global Forum. Want to introduce, or at least recognize, later we will introduce, recognize co-founders of Boston Global Forum. Want to introduce, or at least, I'm getting feedback here on the I'm hearing myself about 10 seconds after I speak, but welcome, Alondra. Welcome, Alondra. How are you? Thank you for coming, Governor Dukakis. And we got a couple of guests that have come quite a ways. Nobody, I don't know, see with the light, I can't quite see where you are in the room, but in from Japan, the Boston Global Forum representative there, Francisco, Italy. Thank you for coming both at some distance. So I do want to recognize Tuan. Everybody in the Boston Global Forum, I think, understands how important Tuan's role has been to developing this organization, putting these events together. We had a very nice lunch, some of us, over at the faculty club. There were 12 of us around the table. There was a 13th person who should have been at the table who wasn't there. That was Tuan. And he's over here organizing things to make sure everything goes off smoothly. And so I think we can all thank Tuan for everything that he does for this organization. Now, I think an organization like the Boston Global Forum really faces the challenge of choosing and scaling its efforts so that they align with its position and its resources. Now, we've not always done that, and I think hits and misses are just inherent in any organization, and we're a relatively young organization. But I think there are two initiatives in particularly where we've struck that balance just about right. One is our AI World Society Initiative, which we launched, some of you will remember, in 2017. And the idea of that initiative is to help shape the governance of AI. And that has led us to work with the G7, with the UN, with the Club de Madrid World Leadership Alliance, and the C20 and the G20 in promoting internationally ethical and responsible uses of AI. The second initiative is more recent. That's the Knowledge Platform for AI. Now, this one truly excites me. It will be a centralized repository of knowledge to inform AI decision-making. We are developing a platform with information that's rooted in ethics and standards, that's comprehensive and reflects diverse viewpoints, that's reliable as a result of careful curation, and that draws from the top minds, organizations, and institutions. And in this initiative, we're going to be partnering with, among others, the Imperial College of London and the Trusted AI Alliance. We'll be organizing seminars and conferences, as well as pushing out information through social media and other ways of disseminating what we have in that repository. This we can do, and this is what we should be doing, something like this for the Boston Global Forum. It's an area in which we can make a difference. Tuan, Nazli, Jeff, David Hall are going to say more about that initiative in the second half of today's program. So now let me introduce Governor Dukakis, who will introduce our special guest and this year's recipient of the World Leader in AIWS. Mike, as you know, three-time governor of Massachusetts, held a faculty position at Northeastern, also one at UCLA. One of his, someone who met him at UCLA was at that lunch today and spoke of that experience as a young student walking into the office and Mike graciously giving him an hour of time. And that's the Mike Dukakis that we know and that's provided such extraordinary leadership for the Boston Global Forum. Mike.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this organization. It's doing very essential work. And we thank all of you for joining us and for working with us on this. Who is that? It's my pleasure to present the 2024 World Leader in AI World Society Award to Dr. Alondra Nelson. Where is she? Oh, okay. This award, which was begun in 2018, is part of the Boston Global Forum's ongoing commitment to promoting the responsible and ethical development of AI. As the former Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Dr. Nelson has played a pivotal role in shaping the landscape of AI governance and policy. Her leadership at OSTP led to the development of the groundbreaking Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which became federal policy through President Biden's executive order. It addresses the critical issue of how AI should be incorporated into government and society. More recently, she was appointed U.S. Representative to the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence. The new advisory board strengthens the UN's efforts to address international governance issues raised by artificial intelligence. Dr. Nelson's leadership has led to let her be named to the Time 100 list of the most influential people in AI and to be designated as one of the top 10 influences in science by Nature magazine. Today, we honor Dr. Nelson's extraordinary contributions and to address our profoundly gratitude for her tireless efforts to advance civil and human rights, democratic freedoms, and responsible AI practices. Her unwavering dedication exemplifies the core principles of the AI World Society initiative, and her vision continues to inspire us all as we navigate the complexities of the AI age. Dr. Nelson, where is she? Thanks, Alondra. Dr. Nelson, on behalf of the Boston Global Forum and the others gathered here and online today, I extend my heartfelt congratulations. We are privileged to recognize your outstanding contributions and look forward to the continued impact of your work. Thank you very, very much. What? Hold on. I got it. Here you are.
Special gift from Jamhuri. We are special gift we present for President APEC. So now we present the founder Alondra Victoria, high respect Alondra Nelson for his achievement, her achievement and contribution.
We're good. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here. If you had asked me 4 years ago, 14 years ago, 40 years ago, if I would be in a room with Governor Dukakis saying kind words about me, I wouldn't have even been able to believe it. And I'm immensely grateful to have the opportunity to meet him, and I'm immensely grateful for this recognition, the award. So thank you, Governor Dukakis. Thank you to the Boston Global Forum. I know they're founders and funders of this important institution here, and just incredibly honored. And, you know, I also want to say that those of us who work in government, you know, do it knowing that it's incredibly hard work and that most people will just probably not say kind things about you, and indeed will say not kind things about you. So it's also just incredibly overwhelming and unexpected. So thank you all. I look forward to the conversation with Professor Patterson, and thank you for your opening remarks. Thank you to Tuan, who, when I was working in Washington, was one of the interesting people who would write to you with encouragement, who would say, we've got some ideas, we've got this white paper, have you seen this article? There's this kind of constant flow of people, and we've only met recently, but we've sort of had this kinship and this commitment to, you know, responsible, equitable science and technology policy, and particularly AI policy. I want to you know, while I'm deeply honored by this, I think any of us who've ever done anything that we hoped would be consequential know that you never do it alone, whether it's writing a paper or, you know, trying to do policy for emerging technology. And there are two people here who were really important parts of that work in Washington. Alex Pascal, who was at the Domestic Policy Council and was really the anchor for science and technology policy there, who's there. Ami Fields-Meyer, who was my advisor at OSTP, and the chief of staff, my chief of staff there, who you'll hear from later. I spied Cam Carey coming into the room, and so I want to also say that as much as we're proud of the work that we did in the Biden-Harris administration and that's still going on, it was people like Cam that really planted seeds, you know, green shoots of things that we were able to do and carry forward in his time in the Biden administration and at the Department of Commerce in particular. So thank you for being here, Cam, and thank you for that work. Okay, so let me get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, I think very much in my personal capacity, I'll be talking, I think about the work and some of the work we did in the Biden-Harris administration, but very much from my own perspective, and now about a year out from having done that work. So the next slide, please. So an obligatory first slide just about what AI is. I think most people are here because they have some inkling or think they have an inkling of what it is. But just to level set, I just borrowed this definition from the OECD, which is that excuse me, I've got two asynchronous slides happening here, so bear with me for just a second as I sort this out. So machine-based systems that make inferences, sometimes we call them predictions. They are not. Recommendations, decisions that create new content based on input that's received in them. These systems can be variously static or iterative. They can be variously dynamic and adaptive. And, that would sort of cover the current, I think, landscape of AI, even anticipating that there will probably be many different ones in our lifetime as well. And next slide, please. So, I share that definition because it's, the OECD has helped us to, I think, distill, and that was derived from the OECD, a definition that sounds very simple, right? It's 2 sentences or so, but for something that's like completely complicated, right? Seemingly simple, software, hardware, math, statistics, but tools that are already having broad impact on society and that are creating and will create new dynamics in the world that are both in the present and in the future. So these are just some clips, some headlines over the last year, some of which you may have seen: economic displacement, national security risks, unhealthy emotional attachments, scam, fraud, and harassment, deep fakes and disinformation, current day harms, including other current day harms, including facial recognition technology gone wrong, profound organizational security risks, cybersecurity risks, the diminishment of personal privacy through data leakage from generative AI, and more. So certainly over the last year, many of us, but certainly in that sort of, I think, very intense reporting period from the end of November of 2022 until the middle of 2023, these kinds of headlines were a constant companion. So, with that kind of bad news, sort of why are we here and why do we care? Like, what's at stake? So next slide, please. So we're here because, we think that there are some potential extraordinary benefits. There could be benefits in science and discovery, so just, basic material science, the ways that we think about the building blocks of the universe. So a great example here, of course, is AlphaFold, which is an AI program developed by Google DeepMind that predicts protein structure, and could potentially lead to novel developments like tackling antibiotic resistance, combating plastic pollution if we're able to design plastic-eating enzymes, and they could even be used in gene editing and for cures and diagnostics. Next slide, please. We care also because there are some implications for issues around accessibility. So there's Waymap, which has been around for several years now, a London-based AI company that has a product that is helping visually impaired people and others navigate their surroundings. It works indoors, it works outdoors, it works in underground, and it has far-reaching potential, and it is already improving people's lives. And of course, we care because of the potential for agriculture. So this is just one headline, a story that I pulled that's really about crop yields and about the ability to use AI to surveil how agriculture is doing and the potential to feed the world, which is something that we still very much struggle to do. So lots of potential for good. AI for good has become a mantra in the UN and elsewhere, but AI for good is not inevitable. And left with where we are now and the kind of governance space, what we have are those headlines that I began with. And so I want to think about today together and talk about what we need to do to create and steward the outcomes that we want with AI. And I want to suggest that I think we know this, but I want to just say it explicitly, that any of the good outcomes that we want or anticipate or expect could come from the use of artificial tools and intelligence tools and systems are not inherent to the technology themselves, right? We must use, steward, and create guardrails for the technology that allow these things to be the case. Next slide, please. So in reaction to the sort of challenges and the sort of hue and cry around AI, there's been lots of attempts to create policy, to create guardrails. There's been extraordinary efforts at AI governance, as Professor Patterson suggested that the Boston Global Forum is already involved in. But early on, you saw with the introduction of ChatGPT, you saw that Italy invoked the General Data Protection Act, the GDPR, to sort of stop the sort of creep of that product into the society, and that kind of contest, that debate is still ongoing. We had an EU Act at the end of EU AI Act at the end of 2023. Of course, the UN is engaged in global governance work that will come to fruition by the time of the next General Assembly. And the US Congress has various policy processes afoot, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So the question is, with all of these processes, I didn't need that slide yet, but okay, getting a little ahead of me. I'll call you when I need the slide. How do we get there, right? In the midst of all of this activity, it would be easy to lose focus on the outcomes that we want and get caught up in the governance. Next slide, please. Instead of reaching, and so what is the right way to regulate AI? This is a piece that I wrote in Foreign Affairs in January. I did not choose the title. As we know, editors choose the title, but I will take credit for giving us now the right way to regulate AI. Haha. But one of the things I offer here in the article is that we do need, I think, 21st century frameworks for thinking about the governance of emerging science and technology, but that these frameworks are really sort of conceptions that I think often will need to bring us back to the fundamental outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think that we've spent a lot of time in the technology policy space thinking about governing the object, right? A lot of our science and technology policy is about regulating spectrum, or regulating telephones, or 5G or 6G as the case may be. You can think regulating the railroad. So we've thought very much about the object. It doesn't work for AI for a few reasons, and much of my conversation this afternoon will be about that. But one of the reasons I mentioned in the very definition of AI at the beginning, it's an iterative dynamic system, right? And so you can't use a regulatory strategy that's about an object that's dynamic and constantly moving. So how do we think about that, for example? It's also a challenge because of the different applications and use cases of something like generative AI that is, so-called general purpose, not quite that, but that's what we call it, but has all of these kind of various applications and use cases. So how do you think about the different regulatory contexts, potentially, or governance contexts that these tools might be used in? So I think instead of reaching for 20th century regulatory frameworks for guidance, that we've got to start with a different first step. We need to ask ourselves why we wish to govern AI at all. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And it's crucial, I think, for policymakers, for leaders, for people in civil society, not only to consider what specific threats they fear from AI, and they are considerable, and that's why I began with that slide, but also what kind of society we want to build. AI governance doesn't need to start from scratch, right? It can emerge from the same fundamental vision of the public good that we have articulated for many, many years in American society. Obviously, there's no society whose members will always share the same vision of the good society or a good future, but democratic societies are built on a basic agreement about core values that citizens hold. In the case of the US, at our best, these include privacy, safety, freedom, equality, and the rule of law. Next slide, please. So how do we govern the future is, I think, the challenge that confronts us. And I want to offer sort of two provocations, two answers, two bits of conversation today. The first around democratic participation, and second around policy innovation. So I think policymakers are too often believe that they're constrained in their approach to policymaking, to governing new systems and new dynamics like AI, because we think that the novelty of a project, we're being told by innovators, by VCs, by entrepreneurs that this product is amazing and you've never seen anything like it. And so of course we think, well, how could our civil rights law have, anything, how could it have any bearing on this incredible, like, jazzy new technology? And we become, I think, trapped in a false sense that new technologies always need specific new laws, right? Our instinct too often becomes to devise new governance paradigms for each new technology development. So my argument in part is that we don't need to create the social compact anew every time there's a new technology. Moreover, those of you who work in the tech development space, so there I know at Lunch I met some folks who are VCs and founders, know that the space is moving very quickly. Even if that was the right strategy for governance, and I think it's not, there's no way we can create whole new social compacts every time we have new forms of technology emerging in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So how might we govern the future? I offer these two observations. So first, let me talk a bit about democratic participation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So November of 2022 was when ChatGPT was released to the public. Those of you who work in the technology space know that AI has been in our lives for many, many years, and including generative AI. But it wasn't until November of 2022 when it went from being a research tools and systems, to being sort of, particularly generative AI, early development, enterprise, business-to-business tools, to being a consumer-facing product, right, in the form of ChatGPT and then other products to follow, that we had a sort of national, international, public debate about AI, right? Before that, it was the thing in yourself, operating, humming in behind your cell phone that, messed up your text messages with its bad autocorrect. It was the thing that opened your telephone using your face and the like, but we didn't really think about it. It wasn't certainly not part of American public discourse. But then we had this moment. And this moment came with it. This is from an early story. This is, I think, like December 3rd in the New York Times. So ChatGPT is released in, I think, November 20th of 2022. A new chatbot from OpenAI is inspiring awe, fear, stunts, and attempts to circumvent its guardrail. So a sense of kind of the whirlwind of that, if you remember going back just not quite a year ago. Next slide, please. So I want to suggest that that there are a couple of ways, that part of the gift, actually, of the whirlwind of the fall of 2023 and the 22 and the winter of 2023 was that the public paid attention for the first time to AI. Many of us working at OSTP, and those of you who teach technology policy or work in engineering in the space of AI, have probably tried for months, if not years, to tell friends, family about these interesting tools and systems, and eyes would glaze over, nobody was interested. But after ChatGPT, you could talk to people, like people could, I think, have a conversation in a different way. I want to suggest that this was a democratic opening, like a tremendous opportunity for the very first time for the general public to feel hailed by conversations about AI. And that is a tremendous opportunity for the governance of AI, because you've got a broader conversation and much more people invested in its outcome. By the start of 2023, as we know, it's been reported, more than 100 million people had reportedly used ChatGPT, and presumably millions others had engaged in some way with some form of generative AI, right? So major sort of diffusion of knowledge about generative AI and AI more broadly, if not usage. And there's some good Pew Research data on that, Research Center data on that distinction. Next slide, please. So this democratic opening was something that we were also trying in our work at the Office of Science and Technology Policy to create, right? well before, a year or more before the emergence of ChatGPT. We appreciated that these tools were potentially so transformative, so powerful, so impactful to so many domains and sectors of society that there was a responsibility of people working in government to engage the public. And the question was, how do you do that with something that's both so abstract and complicated, as the definition I used at the beginning, sort of deceptively simple, hardware, software, inferences, and outputs, but very, very complicated. And I think with the sense that people think, I can't possibly understand this. I'm not a scientist. This is for those other people who work in that area. And so the challenge that we had and what we set out to do was to create a document about American aspirations for governing AI that was addressed to the American people, right? That was addressed to, a reading level that anyone could understand, that did not include jargon, and that was distilled from conversations, over almost a year of conversation, not only with policymakers, not only with some of the great minds at Harvard and MIT, including some in this room, not only with important and pioneering, founders and inventors and entrepreneurs, but also with members of the American public as well. So we had in the process, next slide please, of developing the AI Bill of Rights. In the first instance, we published an op-ed in Wired magazine that included in its last paragraph with an email address inviting the American public to write to the White House with their ideas, their fears, their hopes for the use of artificial intelligence. And we read those emails and engaged in conversation with the public that way. It was also the case that we had a series of roundtables, we had listening sessions, we had all sorts of different ways that people could contact us about this policy stream and about see And the impetus here was that, our founding Bill of Rights, that the United States has had to reinterpret rights over its entire trajectory, and that, we created powerful government, and that powerful governments need powerful checks. If we think about AI as a powerful tool and including a tool that will be engaged in government, how do we want to think about checks on that? What do we want it to look like at its best? And how do we want to prevent it from operating at its worst? Next slide, please. So that process led us to the distillation of 5 principles with related practices, fairly common sense, actually. AI systems should be safe and effective, that one should be protected from algorithmic discrimination, that people should have data privacy, that there should be notice and explanation, meaning certainly in consequential use cases that are consequential for your life, that you should know that an AI tool or system is being used, and that you should have an alternative or a human fallback. So again, particularly when consequential decisions, employment, housing, others are being made about your life, and you should be able to ask how that decision was rendered, and you should be able not only talk to a chatbot, but to talk to a human being about that. We thought this was the very least that the American public, and this is what we heard from the American public, at the very least that we should be leading and framing our work. So this was released, the AI Bill of Rights. Both these principles and the principles are followed by more than 70 pages of practices, actual things that people in business, people in research, and industry were doing, auditing, risk assessment, during the stage of design, during the stage of development, during the stage of deployment. How are they doing it? How are they thinking about doing it? Demonstrating variously that taking these aspirations, these principles, and operationalizing them, beginning to implement them, was already happening in American society, and was possible to do ultimately at scale. Next slide, please. So since this time, so we released again this document in October of 2022, a month before ChatGPT was released. So there was a significant Biden-Harris document on AI and AI policy in advance of the release of ChatGPT. There's been a sort of flowering that's been fascinating, and I'm just naming a few here, of AI bills of rights in states around the United States. California has a bill about civil rights that's advancing the AI Bill of Rights in California and through the sort of civil rights regulation in that state. That was originally introduced last year. It's been reintroduced this year and has good hopes, I think, for passage. Early on the scene was Connecticut. So by June of 2023, Governor Ned Lamont had signed a Connecticut bill asking mandating state legislators there to advance an AI Bill of Rights for the state of Connecticut. And if you follow Connecticut politics or policy at all, you'll know that they've recently introduced, in addition to a Connecticut AI Bill of Rights, legislation that is seeking for the first time to make some of the principles of the AI Bill of Rights binding for industry as well. And then Oklahoma, next slide, please, I want to tell you about, which I think is just absolutely fascinating. So it's a little hard to read. I'll read some of this to you. So, Connecticut and California, we think about, I think, as, predominantly, well, California certainly, but Connecticut, mostly blue states. Here in Oklahoma, a Republican state legislator introduced the Oklahoman AI Bill of Rights for Oklahomans. So red state and Republican legislator, and it takes up from the principles of the AI Bill of Rights and expands these. And I was very pleased to see, this policy or this bill, in particular because it has the same sort of common sense tenor. No one wants to have an automated system discriminate against them. No one wants to have their privacy violated. These are significantly bipartisan issues. The right to know when you're interacting with artificial intelligence. And this one includes also the right to be able to rely on a watermark or some other form of information to know that you're using AI. All right, so for me, these are sort of outgrowths of the kind of democratic opening that came, or the policy opening and the democratic opportunity that came when AI governance became a conversation not just for people like us in the room, but for the general public. And when you were able to convey and communicate to people in language that they understand what the stakes and the potential benefits of these, potentially transformative technologies and systems might be for their lives. So related to this, let me say a little bit about public empowerment. Next slide, please, and then you can move forward to the next slide. Okay, so picking on Eric Schmidt here, but he's not the only one, right? There's a lot of conversation in tech policy space that says only technologists can make tech policy. The people couldn't possibly understand. It's so complicated. And I started with the AI Bill of Rights and the sort of state-level efforts related to that, because people do precisely understand the stakes of this. They can't tell you what a transformer is, but they can't tell you, what the GPT of GPT means, but they can tell you very much what these laws, what these chosen technologies might mean for their life. So, I don't think that we have to, believe, as Eric Schmidt has said in an interview with Fortune and also elsewhere, that we need to leave tech regulation, tech governance only to Silicon Valley. Next slide, please. And we saw a great example of this last summer with the Screen Actor Guild strike in the United States and the Writers Guild strike. So, I think, I know screenwriters, and I have actors in my friend circles and family circle, and none of them would claim to be an expert at AI. In fact, they're among the people that would say, I don't know what you're talking about. But what was so powerful about what I think is the first ever strike around artificial intelligence and what it might mean for these folks' work is that they understood it at the level for how it mattered for their lives, right? And so you can see it in some of the signage. These are from protests during the strike. No digital clones, we are human. So part of it was at stake for actors was the use of their images, of their voice to create digital humans, right? Not only of them as individual actors, but potentially using historic data of performances of actors to create training data, to create new kind of digital personas of people who never actually existed. So not only sort of digital clones of actors themselves, putting them out of work, but, you know, a potential whole industry of a kind of artificial performance. So I think the labor activism and the work of, you know, and the worker empowerment of the Screen Actors Guild strike and the Writers Guild strike really showed us how workers were beginning to voice concerns about being used, you know, to duplicate their likeness, and concluded both successfully with both strikes having provisions that constrained the studios and executives' ability to use AI in the workplace. So I think one or both of these contracts only go until 2026. So that'll, you know, that's like a millennia in AI time, and so the technology will have changed quite a lot. And it'll be interesting to see how it's renegotiated. But I think that, you know, there was something about that moment of releasing to the public ChatGPT, which I think, you know, arguably could have been done much more responsibly with much more preparation for society, but, you know, we are where we are, that allowed these people, these workers, these non-technologists, to be able to have a conversation about what they thought the stakes were. So I think potentially very important. Next slide, please. So let me make a more wonkish turn, next slide please, and talk about policy innovation, which has been one of the more, one of the more fascinating, I think, takeaways from my time working in Washington, because as I soon learned from, so Alex Pascal, who's here, was one of my great policy teachers. My time working in the Biden administration, just over 2 years, was my first ever time working in government. And you go into Washington, and there's this transition, and it's, you know, it's a pandemic, and there's, you know, all hands on deck, and there's a lot to do. And you have, from the campaign and from the transition and from the president, you know, this sort of mission. You have all of these tasks that you're supposed to do, and then you go to meetings, and the answer in every meeting is no. We're not doing that. We can't do that. Like, we don't have the budget. We don't have the votes. We don't have the right. And so the work that I found so fascinating in every meeting was like, how do you get to yes? Like, how do you get anything done when you have a Congress that doesn't work, when you have, you know, all of these things. So policymaking is like, you know, like creating the art of the possible out of like meeting after meeting after meeting where the answer is no. And so I think with AI in particular, it's become an interesting space to think about policy innovation because of some of the things that I started with, the ways that we think about AI in the space of governance and regulation. We don't understand it. It's too complicated. We couldn't possibly regulate it, right? So not only is it no in the policy space, it's like, we don't want to touch it, or if we do touch it, we obviously need like to build a whole other new enterprise around it, right? So some of the, I want to offer kind of a few strategies of policy innovation, both that we used working in Washington and that I think are important, not only for this moment in AI, the moments in AI that are coming behind it, and all of the other, I think, kind of emergent dynamic technologies that are going to be increasingly coming out of the private sector and not out of government. So if you think about the sort of tradition or the arc of R&D in American society, so much of it has been in government first. Like you can think about Mariana Mazzucato's important work about the emergence of the iPhone, right, and how it emerged from DARPA and these various kinds of projects. With ChatGPT, you know, the transformer was built at Google, right? You know, so there might be some pieces, there might have been a graduate student with an NSF grant along the way or something, but we've had a real shift in the R&D ecosystem, and so we're going to be having forms of technology that government hasn't played a role in and can't necessarily anticipate in the sort of regulatory space, right? And so that means we need to sort of also think anew about that. So one of the strategies, I think, is to return to first principles, and I'll say more about this, you know, this to a fundamental vision of the public good. Not freak out about the technology or get giddily excited about the technology, but think sort of, what do we want this technology to do in the world? And as a policymaker, what do we want it to do for the American public? And what do we need to do to make sure it does this thing rather than that thing? Right? And sometimes that means that, believe it or not, existing laws, rules, norms, and standards apply, right? Lena Khan, the chair of the FTC, had said it really well. She sent out a memo, I think last year, where she said, you know, if you discriminate with AI, it's still discrimination. If you commit fraud with AI, it's still fraud. And so, you know, we have sets of clusters of tools and levers already at our disposal. And I think that second bullet point is so important for part of the knock that government gets with regards to regulation, which is like regulatory lag, so slow, so slow. Part of the slowness is when you think you've got to create the social compact anew, right? But if you can say, we've got this lever already, we know how to deal with this issue, then you don't have to spend a lot of time creating new law, new policy. You can actually pivot and use the law and policy that you have in innovative ways, right? And then it is the case, of course, that sometimes new laws and policies may be required. Next slide, please. All right, so on the point that I was just making before about sort of anchoring and, at the fundamentals, and also sometimes using what you've got. I offer just one interesting example, which was about a month ago, the UN Security Council, or the UN Assembly, passed a resolution about AI governance that was introduced by the United States. It was passed by all 193 member states, and it had 123 member state co-authors. Those of you who even follow barely multilateral politics know that that's unheard of. Like, there's literally nothing that we agree on in the UN. And so to get all 193 member states to sign on was extraordinary and quite a feat on the part of the leadership of Ambassador LTG and her team at US-UN. So what does this say, this resolution? It says that uses of AI tools and systems should abide the UN Charter, that uses of AI tools and systems should abide the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and that tools that the UN should encourage uses of AI tools and systems that help us reach the Sustainable Development Goals, right, which we're supposed to reach by 2030 and we are woefully behind upon. And so this is an example of sort of anchoring with the SDGs, like what is it we said we're trying to do? What are the things that we said as a global community that we are trying to do for humanity? And if AI is going to help us get there, how are we going to do that? And also going back in the UN context to the very charter of the UN, right? And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says things like, you have a right to science, you have a right to participate in the way that we make policy around science, and the discovery, the participation, the creation of science, and the like. So that is the context in which we are doing the work. The blue image is the cover of the interim report that the UN High-Level Advisory Board that I serve on released in December. As I said early on, we convened for the first time on October 27th. This interim report came out around December 18th, right? Which is like breakneck speed for any kind of multilateral work, and we were very proud that we got something that we thought was of substance and also that had new ideas for thinking about global governance along the way. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the UN process. It's attempting to have a globally inclusive approach, and the body includes, as I said, folks from all over the world, including considerably from the Global South, and is trying to consult widely and offer recommendations about gaps in global governance that the UN can help distinctly to fill, to coordinate, to map, and the like. Next slide, please. So this report that came out in December made a few assertions. AI should be governed inclusively for the benefit of all, should be governed in the public interest, should be built in step with data governance and the protection of a data commons, should be universal, networked, and rooted in adaptive multi-stakeholder collaboration, including industry as well, and should be anchored in the UN Charter, international human rights, and other agreed upon international commitments. So number 5 now has already been instantiated last month in the General Assembly resolution. Next slide, please. All right, so let me talk a little bit about a few more examples of policy innovation. So as I've been saying, policy enables, it's a way of enabling the desired future states that we want for society. And that policy innovation is creates the conditions of possibility for these desired future states. Next slide. So one example of this is an outgrowth of President Biden's October of 2023 executive order on AI. So one of the many mandates of this 111-page document, which I think is the longest executive order in American history, mandated the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the Executive Office of the President, to create new policy around advancing governance, innovation, and risk management, and agency use of artificial intelligence. So this document is interesting and I think forward-leaning and important for so many different reasons. In part, it establishes that the work of the government should be about advancing both rights and safety in AI. And those of you who are sort of around my age, remember there were earlier times when, and this is a time when government's about to make very significant investments in technology, right? We're about to make, I think, across the federal government, a kind of once-in-generation technology investment across the federal government. And we might compare that to the introduction of the personal computer in government, right? Where there was sort of, each office brought a few computers here and there. We're going to do these systems kind of all at once. And so it's an extraordinary lever for government, this lever of procurement, to be able to say, if we're going to spend, because a part of, if you follow, FT or Bloomberg about the news of the sort of the political economy around sort of generative AI in particular, they're happy for us to play with ChatGPT, but the political economy is really about enterprise contracts, right? Including enterprise contracts with the federal government. So it is going to be a tremendous, not exactly one-off, but sort of, close to one-time opportunity to shape what that ecosystem looks like on the part of the world's largest consumer, which is the US federal government. So what this memo does is offer guidance for that work. And I think is an extraordinary form of policy innovation that that folks should read and think about. So OMB is probably the wonkiest of the federal government, but this is policy innovation as well. Next slide. So I want to point as well to policy innovation as a way to do governance or do regulation when you're not thinking about the technology as the thing you're regulating, when you're thinking about the outcome, you can think about, and this was part of our strategy at OSTP, not only for AI, but for other things, like what do we want? And this really came from President Biden. Like science and technology is supposed to do stuff for the American people, right? Like if you're not doing science and technology policy right, if it's not sort of expanding opportunity to people, not allowing people to sort of start businesses, to have opportunities to educate themselves, have opportunities to have better health, better lives, and the like. So can we govern, regulate to enable opportunity, to strategically steward science and technology investments, not only to prevent harm, but also to enhance people's lives? Next slide, please. So a great example of this related to AI policy, of course, is the CHIPS and Science Act. So this is an image from the signing of that act in the summer of 2022 that I will just say as a side note that we experienced in the White House as like, this is never going to happen. And then all of a sudden it was like, there's like a bill, there's a law, there's a law. Okay, so CHIPS and Science, right? So you would have heard of CHIPS and Science as being historic, important law that is actually changing the political economy, the supply chain of semiconductors, right? Notably, mostly memory, different kinds of semiconductors, but in the AI space, importantly, also GPUs. The president was in Syracuse last week, actually announcing a partnership with Micron, which does memory semiconductors, a little bit different. But what was important about that presentation, which was announcing a multi-million-dollar investment in semiconductor manufacturing, in Syracuse, was about all the other things that come with it, right? That the investments from the CHIPS and science piece, right, are through Micron and through these the public-private partnership, expanding job training for rural communities, for veterans, for mothers returning to work, encouraging the training of students in tribal colleges and minority-serving institutions, mandating that childcare be set up for workers, engaging community colleges and the pipeline for workers and the like. So the issue here is like if government is always making investments anyways, how can these be used to steward the outcomes to govern for the future? So potentially, if this goes as planned, and some obviously policy does not always, this policy will have help to put American manufacturing, sort of back in the center of the sort of stack or the pipeline that you need to create AI, and will also be doing lots of good for people's lives and including other things like creating construction jobs and the like. Next slide, please. So, policy and another beat on policy innovation, that governance enables innovation. Like, it's a ballast that provides proactive governance, offers stability and provides a controlled range of motion. Because one of the arguments that we often hear is that you can have innovation or you can have regulation. You can't have them both, and it's going to mess everything up. Next slide, please. So I would just remind you that May of last year, Sam Altman at the Senate Judiciary Committee, as the New York Times, and as I'm quoting them, reported it, quote unquote, implored the Senate to regulate open AI. We know that he would tour Europe the next month and say almost the opposite. But I think there is an appreciation, I think even among important colleagues in industry, that the sort of landscape of AI, research and development is a little scrambled, and that some rules of the road would be helpful even for business. Next slide, please. All right, so this is my last slide. So why I think policy and innovation is important, and how I think all of these, which are current investments, in part that help us govern the future, is that they allow us to fundamentally reject choice architectures that create these false dilemmas for us that I think we are given by the media, we're given also sometimes from PR hype from companies, but actually don't have to be true if we are engaged in engaging the public and what they want these tools and systems to do in their life, and also thinking in innovative ways about how we might do that. So if we engage these together, we can reject choice architectures that create a false dilemma of either pursuing efficiency or ensuring equity, of having safety or innovation, that safety and innovation, indeed, and AI are not mutually exclusive things. The charter for the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which was stood up in 1976 for reasons we can talk about, which are kind of historically fascinating, includes a phrase that's something like, the job of OSTP is to mitigate foreseeable harms and to advance the potential of science and technology. And that's really what we're called to do in AI governance, to do a kind of anticipatory governance that uses policy innovation, that doesn't try to predict, because we can't, but that tries to use our best guesses, and I think that aligns with the values and the outcomes that we want, and aligns also with using these tools to improve people's lives. And I think if we think about the sort of landscape, the horizon of AI governance that awaits us, that we have a cause for some optimism, as Governor Dukakis would want us to be, because we see that we've already had some success, I think, stewarding the outcomes we want, and that this can be done with prudent policy and an increasingly empowered public. Thank you.